Hi, welcome everyone. Um, as people join the webinar, if you all can just put in the chat your name and where you're calling in from, that would be great so we know who's on today. And we'll get started in a few minutes. We're just going to give it a few minutes for people to join. Welcome everyone. For those of you just joining, we're asking folks to drop your name and where you're calling in from in the chat so we know who's on. And we'll start in maybe 2 or 3 minutes. Welcome, everyone. For those of you just joining, we're asking that people send their names and where they're calling in from in the chat so we know where people are calling in from. And we'll start in about 1 more minute. We're just giving it a few minutes in the beginning for folks to join. And I do want to say right now, before we get started, this is an anti-oppressive, anti-Zionist space. So any racist, Zionist, Islamophobic comments will not be tolerated. If we see anything like that in the chat, we will remove you from the webinar. And if people experience any issues, you can message us. And if you have questions, please use the Q&A function in the chat, and sorry, in the webinar, in the Zoom, so we can keep track. We're not going to be able to follow all of your questions in the chat, so please use the Q&A feature so that we can actually be able to see what your questions are. Thanks, everyone. We'll get started in 1 minute. There's still people joining. So again, as folks are joining, just share with us your name and where you're calling from, and we'll start in a little bit. All right. Okay. Okay, welcome, everyone. My name is Celine. I'm with the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. So today's webinar is going to be focused on the largest and most influential lobby group in the United States, AIPAC. While people across the US are facing housing and healthcare insecurity, lack of social services, collapsing infrastructure, AIPAC is supporting politicians to continue to vote for weapons packages to sustain Zionist military occupation and genocide while ignoring the needs of their own constituents. Last month, our webinar was focused on how people can organize city campaigns for an arms embargo. And this month, we're getting into the political machinery that keeps those weapons flowing, spearheaded by AIPAC. We can't talk about stopping US complicity in genocide without understanding the political infrastructure that protects, that advances the arms industry. Um, and like AIPAC, you will probably get into this more in the webinar, but AIPAC actually originated during a moment of public opinion crisis for Israel. And today, as Israel invests millions into PR campaigns, censorship efforts, as it pressures tech platforms and pushes policy to criminalize anti-Zionist speech and tries to erase documentation of war crimes, we see AIPAC playing this same role. This is an infrastructure designed to manufacture consent for genocide and keep U.S. policy, not only invested in Israeli interests, but in war in general. And, especially in this moment where we've seen the growth of our movement over the past 2 years, the extent to which public opinion has shifted in favor of Palestine and against Israel. Public opinion in favor of Israel is at the lowest it's ever been. And our objective is to really cement this, to turn this shift in public opinion into concrete gains for the Palestine movement. And it's the fact that the movement has grown so much that has triggered this response of increased censorship and attempts to erase documentation of genocide. So again, the objective here is to make association with AIPAC politically and socially untenable, because our ability to succeed in our campaigns, all the campaigns that we've talked about in previous webinars here, whether it's like for arms embargo or divestment, this is directly tied to the way that Israel is perceived. So, this means that we need to ensure the cultural, institutional, media, and political rejection of AIPAC funding and influence as the kind of the spearhead in the face of the Israel lobby. So, this means exposing their playbook, isolating them, making it costly for politicians to accept AIPAC funding for supporting pro-Israel positions. And so tonight we have with us Iman from the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights and Nidat from the AIPAC Out of US Politics campaign. And they're both going to share with us the role that AIPAC plays. We're going to learn about this campaign to reject Israeli influence over US policy. And we're going to learn about how we can challenge AIPAC, how we as a movement in the US can isolate Zionism, can expose the lobby that defends its interests, and make sure that it never regains legitimacy. So thank you all so much for joining us. I'm going to first pass it to Iman. And again, just before we get started, because I saw a lot more people join, please keep sharing your name and where you're calling from. And if you have questions, use the Q&A function. We're not going to be able to follow all questions in the chat. So we'll do our best to answer our questions in the chat throughout, and we'll try to have time for Q&A towards the end. So I'm going to pass it first to Iman to just tell us about AIPAC. What is it? How does it operate? And how does it reach various sectors of American society?
Thanks, Celine, and thanks everyone for being here. Again, my name is Iman. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Organizing at the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights Action, and just deeply grateful for the conversation we're going to have today about the role of AIPAC, understanding its influence, understanding just how it came to be, why it came to be, and how it's kind of built up its own influence. And then my hope is to also kind of touch on just some of the tactics and the different avenues that AIPAC has used to gain its legitimacy within Congress and the steps of Capitol Hill. And so there's probably some things I'll touch on that you probably already know, but I really just want to help us paint the picture on how this all started. I want to begin with just kind of the origins around the Zionist and pro-Israel advocacy, lobby. And so it's really important to start back in the 1940s, which is where the pro-Israel lobbying in the US actually began with the American Zionist Emergency Council, which was called AZEC at the time. And the goal of that specific council was to promote support for the establishment of a Jewish state. And again, this is in the early 1940s, prior to the Jewish state coming to be. But clearly, there was some role that the Zionists believed that the U.S. had to play in upholding its popularization and its legitimacy and its support, and understanding that the U.S. needed to stand in its support. It actually didn't get called AIPAC until later on in 1951, or excuse me, in the 1953. Soon after the Kibia massacre, which occurred during Operation Shoshana, which was an Israeli so-called reprisal operation that occurred in October of 1953 when the IDF's Unit 101, led by future Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, attacked the village of Kibia in the West Bank, which was then at the time under Jordanian control, but killed more than 69 Palestinian civilians, two-thirds of whom were women and children. At the time as well, there were 45 houses, schools, and a mosque were all destroyed. The massacre itself was condemned by the U.S. State Department, the UN Security Council, and by Jewish communities worldwide. The State Department here, in fact, actually called it the raid as shocking and used the occasion to confirm publicly that economic aid to Israel had been suspended previously for all other noncompliance regarding the 1949 armistice agreements. It was this condemnation that AIPAC was actually then formed. So it evolved out of that AZAC council and kind of renamed itself to both kind of regain popularity and kind of start anew. So at the time that it began, again in 1953, we started to notice its institutionalization, its expansion, and again how it started to kind of create the pillars by which it gained its own power. It started to create its own reputation across Congress by establishing strong relationships with members of Congress. In the 50s into the 60s, it started at the time again producing widely read policy memos. So I think a lot of folks here are quite aware that AIPAC has informed members of Congress through these memos that they provide on actually a weekly basis, if not a daily basis, since its existence. Its interest was in cultivating bipartisan ties. It wasn't necessarily just tied to the Democratic or the Republican Party. It was interested in gaining as much support as possible across different party lines, again, to ensure that there was enough support for Israel across all parties. And it essentially presented itself as a mainstream and nonpartisan organization. Although we, of course, know that that's not true, it's the way it portrayed itself. And again, it was something it's always been inherently fundamental to AIPAC. AIPAC's early success actually came largely from effective granular work with congressional offices. So it offered detailed briefings, constituent mobilization, and even messaging on U.S.-Israel cooperation. Of course, that has now been consistently used. It's consistently being produced. We oftentimes see members of Congress using, again, going back to the 50s, been using language presented by AIPAC on how to speak about the issue, on how to dehumanize Palestinians, on how to completely dissuade folks from ever using any sort of data that even comes from Palestinian bodies and to use whatever comes out of AIPAC as a legitimate source. So a lot of this, again, has kind of been going on for decades. It was actually kind of just taking us now to this next moment in time for AIPAC. I want to kind of take us to the 1967 Six-Day War, which for many folks again, I don't know how many folks here are well aware of that, but it's actually when we started to see it was one of the largest land grabs where Israel occupied the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Egyptian Sinai, the Syrian Golan Heights, and even expanded into Jerusalem. And of course, the US, they started to see the US as this prominent ally for its ability to have such land expansion. And we started to see a gain in popularity and public sympathy for Israel around the 1967 war. It was again, it's clear military victory here in grabbing land and detaining over 500,000 Palestinians, removing over 1,500 Palestinians, forcibly displacing them. To the US, this is kind of when a lot of these shared strategic interests started building. And AIPAC really capitalized on this shift, both by promoting military aid as part of its Cold War strategy and expanding its support network across Christian, labor, and civic groups. It was at this time that this period itself actually started to mark the start of Israel being seen as a key U.S. regional ally. And if anyone here is well aware of how members of Congress oftentimes talk about Israel, it's always seen as its democratic ally. It's almost serves as this proxy to the U.S. in the Middle East, as we've come to find. And of course, again, you kind of see where that's all formulated from. And then we start to kind of continue on with seeing just this consolidation of congressional influence. Between the 1970s and 1980s, AIPAC's influence deepened due to several structural advantages. One, the professionalization of lobbying. AIPAC at this time, again, between the 1970s and 1980s, built out a large policy team that mastered the technical details of foreign aid legislation, and it became known for exceptionally thorough briefings and rapid response communications. And so, again, we started to see just how professionalized AIPAC became and how integrated they were in these different lobbying streams. And so it began to build out its own policy team as it started to understand more of its influence. It also started to do a lot more grassroots fundraising outside of AIPAC itself. So AIPAC is actually a 501(c)(4), and at the time did not donate directly to candidates, but over time has changed. But it is a network of pro-Israel has become a network of pro-Israel political action committees that have formed independently out of AIPAC. And AIPAC has also provided information that has helped allied groups coordinate messaging. So it's again been able to reach the masses through this messaging coordinated strategy in campaigns. And that's been able to amplify its relationship to donors and the PACs that have formed outside of AIPAC that are still a part of the AIPAC ecosystem. And so we start to see this mass uproar in support for AIPAC over, again, the 1970s into the 1980s and, of course, leading into the early 2000s. We also start to see the bipartisan positioning that AIPAC has kind of situated itself in, which is where AIPAC, again, it's framed its mission as protecting the U.S. as a strategic democratic ally. We can say democratic in quotes, but it's been believable by both people on the different sides of the aisle. And it invested heavily in cultivating relationships with both those Democratic and Republican lawmakers, making support for Israel a consensus issue, especially during the Cold War. And then we kind of move into the later 1980s, into the 2000s. So towards the end of the 20th century, AIPAC was actually commonly regarded as one of the most powerful foreign policy lobbies in Washington. And it's actually important to recognize just specifically what those key factors are that kind of led AIPAC to play that role. One, of course, is the Cold War alignment. Israel was seen as a counterweight to Soviet influence in the Middle East. There was growing U.S. military cooperation, so joint weapons programs and intelligence sharing increased Israel's strategic value to the U.S. And then there was consistent congressional engagement. So again, through its expansion of its policy team and its ability to coordinate amongst the grassroots masses, it was able to then cultivate these annual conferences and build out these different activists who then do these train the trainer programs to be able to kind of build out its own ecosystem and really start developing even deeper ties with members of Congress so that again AIPAC has actually, of course, as we all know, has become one, and up until this point was one of the largest and most powerful lobbying institutions in the U.S. We start to see, of course, a lot of that kind of goes hand in hand with what Congress starts to pass, which is large, reliable military aid packages to Israel. We start to see strong pro-Israel resolutions, again, continuing to amplify the U.S. and the Israel role. And we even start to see legislation addressing regional adversaries. So, for instance, with Iran sanctions, we start to see that. And we know that again, the AIPAC itself has been an advocate, excuse me, for forever wars. It's been really interested in seeing this because it only supports the Israeli agenda and has been able to support this interest in continued arms transfers and military aid funding. And so, to them to be able to support again, itself has actually been It's been helpful for them to support these ongoing wars, as we've seen, as it's helpful to them in their own agenda. Um, Kind of taking us into the early 2000s and into the 2020s, we start to see AIPAC kind of not necessarily lose its influence just yet, but it starts to become a little bit more polarized. Between this time is actually quite important because this is when we start to see the shifts within the Democratic Party. There's a rise in progressive skepticism of U.S. Israel policy for many reasons. But of course, I want to say that with the access to technology and the access to stories and what's been going on in the ground in Palestine, specifically around this time, we start to see a shift in that and a rise in just, again, this skepticism, this questioning of just why are we offering this entity the aid that we do while it's taking part in these violations of international law and all these other things. We also start to see the emergence of alternative advocacy groups. We see things, the J Street, which is kind of more center left, and other organizations like If Not Now and Jewish Voices for Peace, which represent more of the left. And so there's a lot more Jewish-based organizing that is also building up across these policy spaces that is also starting to put to question the AIPAC platform, the AIPAC policy platform, and starting to actually question just why and what the relationship to Israel should and what it actually looks like. And then we also start to see the evolving views among Americans. The popularity starts to decrease at this time. And of course, we're kind of talking now, even up until this moment in time, regarding the genocide in Gaza. Those types of I think many folks are probably here seeing a lot of different polling that has just kind of shown the growing dissent against both the United States aiding and abetting not only the genocide in Gaza, but even before with and continued rather settlement expansion that's happening across the West Bank and settler violence. And so a lot of these evolving views have actually shifted support for AIPAC and even kind of led into these other organizations that we've talked about. And we've also seen just the contentious Israeli domestic politics, whether it be the racist nation state laws that they have in place, and we start to see the apartheid regulated laws that are in place that have actually started to showcase again what reality really looks like for Palestinians on the ground. And a lot of this is kind of again kind of takes us to today in this point in time. It's something that we're starting to see a shift in power around when it comes to even talking specifically around just what AIPAC has been capable of doing and how and what types of methods it's used to really establish its place of power, we've seen that it just about comes after anyone and any member of Congress who decides to speak out against in Israel. And so we saw this, for instance, with Cori Bush most recently and Wesley Ball, where Cori Bush was one of one of the strongest advocates for Palestine at the time. And of course, AIPAC funneled millions and millions of dollars to be able to get her out. And so, of course, we end up with a pro-Israel candidate. And a lot of that similar method is used in different spaces as well. And we continue to see, even now entering into the midterm elections, but we continue to just see what sorts of authority AIPAC kind of establishes itself with and how it does. And it, of course, continues to use the same old tactics it's used since the 1950s. Um, so I'll stop there. And I think I'll pass it back to Slee.
Yeah, thank you, Iman, for like a concise history of APAC and how it originated and how it operates. Um, and I know like we're seeing this in the question that come up in the chat, like how can we do something about this, or like what's the approach that we should take? And we know that we've seen actually like across like the political spectrum, a lot of people questioning like why so much money is directed towards Israel from, on a local level. Like if you go on the US military funding map on the US CPR page, you can find out like how much money your own locale is investing in Israel. And so as we've seen like the increasing like um, uh, scrutiny of AIPAC's role, why need that? Is it important now that we focus on AIPAC as a target of this campaign? And can you just tell us about like the AIPAC out of US politics campaign and different ways people can get involved?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much, Celine, and thank you, USCPR Action, for having us on. This campaign has been launched recently with the idea of taking all of the anti-APAC efforts that have already been established over the past, honestly, primarily 2 years, but really there's a longer history of these active efforts, taking them and really putting them towards channeling them towards the grassroots level. And so we've talked a lot about, after 2 years of escalated genocide, what becomes then the role of people living in the United States in fighting against this genocide and isolating Israel, and continuing to solidify the wins that the movement has made on a narrative, and really like a global level. And really part of it is that, there's efforts like Reject APAC, which I know Iman will talk about a little bit more in just a little bit, and but that focus more on the politicians and on the candidates. And then what APAC out of US politics really wants to do again is to work on a grassroots level, is to really speak to the average American, that an average person really that rejects, regardless of where they are in the political spectrum, rejects, a genocide and rejects mass atrocities, is really concerned about wasting taxpayer dollars on funding Israel's genocide. And also really using this as an opportunity to show the contradictions that exist within, the democracy of this country, primarily through the way that these lobby groups are allowed to operate. And essentially buy out our politicians, and intimidate them into certain positions, which I can talk a little bit about that. I also want to just go back a little bit in the last 2 years. When we think about, why APAC out and why now, we think about the progress that's been made in the past 2 years, especially on a campaigns level. Big shout out to USCPR Action for really having consistent webinars, covering the different kinds of campaigns that are taking place across the country. But really, we've seen strides and wins in corporate pressure campaigns, in university divestment campaigns, with some universities finally moving towards establishing divestment criteria that moves away from funding war and genocide, and even accomplishing wins, targeting weapons manufacturers. We've seen it across the country and even in Europe with targeting of Elbit systems and other weapons manufacturers. And then in the US as well, targeting logistics giants that make these transfer of weapons possible to begin with. So we've made all of these strides and really have made progress on these different areas of I guess support for Israel and support for genocide. But really one area where we haven't really done our part on a grassroots level is really targeting the political arm of Zionism. Like Celine said at the beginning of this session, we can target and we should target the military defense and technology arm of Zionism in the US, and that includes the logistics, the weapons manufacturers. But also, we need to keep in mind that there's a political arm that ensures that this flow of weapon continues uninterrupted, that economic support to Israel continues so that Israel can have the ability to spend more on weapons and technology to commit genocide against the Palestinian people. So for a long time, I think AIPAC has been this almost unreachable target. We understand that AIPAC is this large lobby group and it represents more than just AIPAC, really. I saw a question in the chat earlier about, what are the different PACs and organizations that fall under AIPAC? There's the I think it's the United Democracy Project. That is their super PAC. So it's through that super PAC that they are able to support candidates in their elections and pay essentially for their elections. And then you have the American Israeli Education Fund, which is the nonprofit that supports politicians and others in leadership positions to take trips, essentially vacations to Israel so that they can buy their support. And really, like when we look at what these trips look like, especially in the past 2 years, it's essentially taking politicians, decision makers to occupied Palestinian land so that they can enjoy a vacation just mere miles away from where one of the most horrific genocides of recent history is taking place. That's what AIPAC does, right? It buys out. And Iman said this much more succinctly than I can, but really, AIPAC plays like a very significant role in ensuring the political and diplomatic support for Israel continues uninterrupted, and that the social and cultural, legs of support for Zionism are also strong. And this encompasses the media, this encompasses the narrative. So when we think about the ecosystem that allows for Zionism to ensure it has support in the US, we no matter which way we turn, we're always going to look back, we're always going to come back to AIPAC in one way, shape, or form. There are questions about other lobbyist groups in the chat, and while it's important that we target any really group that's uplifting the Israel lobby and intimidating politicians into supporting Israel at the expense of the needs of the American people, it's also important for us to see that AIPAC really is the most vital organ in this Zionist ecosystem. So once AIPAC is weakened, we understand that these other organizations, whether it's with direct ties to AIPAC or loose ties with AIPAC through their membership, are also weakened. And so again, it goes back to this idea of AIPAC has always seemed untouchable. It's this organization that seems like it has an amount of power that we cannot really shake. But really, we've made so much strides in the past 2 years that this is the next step for the movement here in the US. And it's time for us to expose AIPAC for what it is at a time when the American people, more than ever before, are starting to question and doubt support for Israel. We know, besides the fact that AIPAC is very critical to the ecosystem of ensuring support for Zionism in Israel, we also know, to Celine's earlier point, that Israel is at a stage where it's the most isolated it's ever been, politically and on a global stage. And so, we know that a priority for Israel, and in fact, its foreign ministry is dedicating hundreds of millions of dollars to Hasbara and pro-Israel propaganda. There, Israel's really at a stage where in order to ensure its continuation and support for its colonial project, it needs to solidify its image once again, because really its image has been destroyed in so many ways. um, and so it's really about this idea of rebranding itself, and we're seeing APAC really take this up. If we pay close attention to the APAC website, what we're seeing is, there's almost like a concerted attempt at moving away from this lobby group that represents the interests of Israel primarily to a lobby group that represents the image, the American people, claiming that it is within the American people's benefit for the US to support Israel and support its genocide. Yes, I know. I see Dana saying, their ad was so bad. Absolutely, it was. But it's showing that this targeting is effective, because they are now afraid, and they're now on the end where they need to justify, what it is that they do. Um, and so I think for us, on the APAC out of US politics level, it's really as a campaign, it's very important that we expose the various ways that APAC influences US politics beyond just what we might see on the surface level. Um, it's because there's always a way around uh, making it seem that lobbying in the US is somehow, um, these giant corporate lobbies can somehow always try to frame their lobbying as a part of the democratic process. But what we know is that it's full of corrupt practices, that really, if anything, push us as far away of democracy from democracy as possible. In the past few years, we've seen AIPAC essentially install politicians into seats, right? Essentially hijacking elections. We look at the election of Cori Bush, and this was mentioned in the chat earlier that she's running again. But really, what they did there is they outspent Cori Bush in the primaries, to the tune of, I believe, $8.5 million dollars. And a lot of this money was spent on propaganda against Cori Bush, mailing folks in her district, even utilizing like racist rhetoric against Cori Bush, saying that she's ineffective. Um, all because of her stance on Palestine, and essentially promoting Wesley Bell as this progressive candidate that, since he's entered office, we know, is not very true. And the primary difference really is that Wesley Bell is pro-Israel through and through, and Cori Bush, at a time when a lot of members of Congress were afraid, and they still are, to ever voice opposition to Israel. She was one that introduced the resolution for ceasefire just 9 days after the start of the genocide in October of 2023. So really, they install politicians into seats, and this is usually through outspending opponents in election cycles. But also, there's a big role for AIPAC to play in influencing the media. We know that on Capitol Hill, AIPAC has exclusive I'm blanking on the word, but exclusive access to private briefings with the media, right? And with media outlets. That there have been in the past close ties reported to the editorial boards of major news outlets like the Washington Post, like New York Times, and their objective is pretty clear. It's to skew media and language in favor of Israel and shedding doubt on on anything that the people can see in clear sight. Um, and even more than that, we know that AIPAC joined forces in 2023 with the ADL and one other Zionist organization that it's not at the top of my mind right now. And they started something called the October 7th Project. This project was being consulted, or they hired a consulting firm called the SKDK. SKDK is a registered foreign agent for Israel. So really what our role is to step back and to really expose what AIPAC does, the connections that it has to the broader Zionist network, how it ensures that support remains uninterrupted for Israel. Um, Simply by speaking to the facts, right? What does AIPAC do on Capitol Hill? How do they manipulate American election cycles? And how are politicians prioritizing the needs of Israel, funding genocide, ensuring that Israel has the highest technology that it can to surveil and harass Palestinians and undermine the sovereignty of governments in the Arab region? All of these various things that Israel has as a priority over the needs of the American people at a time when the conditions, the material conditions of the American people are continuing to worsen. Um, and we're seeing that through, the high rates of inflation, the increasing grocery prices, housing becoming more unaffordable in what is thought to be more affordable cities across the country. So I'll really stop here. I think what I want to deliver about APAC out is that it's time that we also begin to reach out to the average person in the US, the average person that stands against genocide, that doesn't want to see their tax dollars wasted supporting a foreign government, and that wants material conditions in the US to improve, and tying it back to how AIPAC plays a role in interfering in that process. Um, and it's time that we get the voters to make it clear that, if a politician takes money from AIPAC, that is a sign of abandoning their constituents. And the American people won't stand for that. They won't stand for genocide, and they won't stand for billions of dollars worth of aid to a foreign country implicated on a global level in genocide, occupation, and colonialism. I'm happy to answer the questions towards the end, or if there's anything you'd like me to elaborate on right now, Celine. Just kind of felt that I was kind of rambling a little, so pass it back to you.
No, no, this was really good information. Thank you, Nida. And yeah, I mean, just to reiterate Nida's point, like, our role is to really make any association with Zionism toxic, right? So we're going after where there is the most attention, which is on AIPAC right now, and that helps us make the entire Israel lobby toxic. By like having this campaign focused on AIPAC, we're going to be impacting the legitimacy of the entire Israel lobby, including like every group that makes up the Israel lobby. And it's important. We've talked about this in previous webinars to be also clear and targeted in our campaigns. We know there's many corporations and many institutions, but we have to be strategic in what we choose and why. And I think Nida broke it down really well, like why AIPAC and why now. I want to come back to Iman real quick to just talk to us a little bit about the Reject AIPAC campaign and how this complements the grassroots AIPAC out of US politics campaign. And then we'll come back to Nida for concrete ways people can organize around this. And if we have time, we'll do Q&As.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nida, and thanks all again for being here to just learn so much more. I wanted to just spend a couple of minutes talking about the Reject AIPAC campaign, which I'll drop right here for folks, just so you can see what I'm talking about. So this is I saw a couple of questions around like, are we as an organization actually allying with different organizations who are also doing the same thing and working to toxify and kind of just show and help just the general like masses really understand what harmful role AIPAC has played and all its other allied PACs. And we have actually been taking part in a coalition that's called Reject AIPAC, not just with organizations like JVP, but a lot of other organizations who are also doing a lot more of this political work to kind of just showcase again the harms by which AIPAC has participated in. And so it's called the Reject AIPAC Coalition. It's a broad coalition of progressive groups working together to take on AIPAC and its affiliated dark money super PACs across electoral, political, digital, and organizing strategies. So I saw a couple of questions around, are we talking about DMFI, the United, I don't even remember all the names of the PACs that AIPAC has formulated. But our intention behind identifying AIPAC as kind of like the broad name, we understand that it's not just AIPAC. I think everyone here is well aware of that. Of course, AIPAC just formulated its own super PAC, so it can donate directly to candidates. But we know it also works under the guise of other PACs. And so it's critical for us to establish a campaign, to be a coordinated campaign across the different organizations, to be able to kind of draw out just what actually exists, what's actually getting into the hands of members of Congress. And so this specific coalition also focuses primarily on the contributions that get made directly to members of Congress, and hopefully will actually also expand the ever-growing disapproval that is being made by even local officials, local electeds that are running across different states right now that have also rejected AIPAC contributions. And so the hope here is to kind of both amplify just the educational awareness to members of Congress around why it's harmful to continue taking these contributions, and to actually get members of Congress to sign pledges committing to not taking AIPAC contributions. Fortunately for us, I think that we've seen, I want to say the fortunate, there's nothing really fortunate that comes out of genocide, but we're starting to see that because of the level of dissent and the level of disapproval for Israel's policies and this engagement around the genocide in Gaza, we have actually started to see organic distancing from AIPAC by members of Congress, and even people who are running for office, who are locally running for offices in places like Iowa and Ohio and Michigan and so many other spaces that may not have anything to do with Congress, but are still starting to see the negative consequences around their associations with AIPAC, so long as AIPAC offers its contributions to them. And so we continue to amplify the need to continue distancing oneself from AIPAC. We continue trying to get folks to sign these pledges so that, again, people just like us, anyone who wants to vote in an election, can make their decisions based on the decisions people have made around this issue particularly, and like continuing to grow that level of support for this specific demand. And then the way in which we kind of see this kind of going hand in hand is that this Reject AIPAC coalition, again, focuses primarily on elected officials. And we're really excited about the AIPAC out of US politics campaign, because it's also really important to ensure that we're getting the level of support that we need from constituents that these members of Congress are supposed to be serving. It's really important for us to help amplify on both ends just how important it is, and how really ugly AIPAC has become and continues to be for what it chooses to do anytime anyone dare criticize the Zionist entity. So we continue to be a part of that work. We're really excited to see where it kind of goes, especially now that we're entering into the 2026 midterms, and kind of just see what everything's going on in there. I also just wanted to I'll drop this in a second, but I wanted to say that there's actually a really great article on in Truth Out, it's titled "Is the Tide Starting to Turn Against AIPAC?" This was actually just put out yesterday, but it actually continues to show just despite the fact that there is, and for instance, let's talk about Jamal Bowman's race. There was $22 million spent to oust this man. there are still folks who are even far more progressive than Jamal Bowman who are deciding to show up in that district and run. And it's just kind of proving to us yet again that AIPAC actually doesn't have the power to silence us. AIPAC doesn't have the power to completely remove us from these different these areas and these regions. And so I'm really excited that again we continue seeing this being amplified. And I'll drop the article in the chat, and with that, I'll pass it back to you, Celine.
Thanks, Iman, so much. And then passing it back to Nidat for my final question, which is like concretely, what can people do to get involved in the AIPAC Out of US Politics campaign, and like what are ways they can popularize like the petition and get involved?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Celine. Thank you so much. I think the idea with the APAC Out campaign, similar to the, people's embargo for Palestine and many of the other campaigns that have been taken up in the past few years, is that really folks take up this campaign in the way that relates best to their locale. Part of there's a lot of questions in the chat around like who funds APAC? How does APAC get its money? And the truth is because APAC gets to continue operating without being registered as a foreign agent. A lot of details of how, who donates to APAC and how much is just not public record. So really, what's important is that we begin to do research and we examine these things and identify where does APAC have influence in our locales, maybe it's your local congressperson that's taking millions of dollars from APAC, and that's how they're securing their seat. Or it's your university that's hiring a foreign agent SKDK to provide them consulting on developing ways to combat anti-Semitism on campus. There are various ways that I think AIPAC extends its influence across the various cities and districts in the country. And really, the idea is that organizations, collectives begin to look into where is AIPAC, where is the Israel lobby in my locale, and what are we going to do to weaken AIPAC and to target it, to isolate it, and to make it known that we reject any support that's coming from AIPAC towards into our politics or into our local institutions. So I think that there's many ways that we can go about popularizing this campaign. One thing about APAC that I think we can all probably attest to is that APAC is a very well-known, it's an infamous name, right? Like folks have heard of APAC, and the perception of lobbyist groups in general can truly be can be negative at times, right? Which is to our benefit here. And so really hosting events around like the history of APAC, exposing a lot of the information that Iman went over. How was APAC born out of a Zionist group that was going to be forced into registering as a foreign agent, and so many like of these other facts that when we look to, it's pretty damning against APAC, right? So. I think we can host events locally. We can really push the petition that's on the APAC Out website, which I want to encourage all of us to take a moment and sign right now, actually. It's this idea that we want the data to back what we're saying. We know that the vast majority of Americans across the political spectrum reject their tax dollars going towards genocide. We know that Americans reject Israel's needs being prioritized over the material needs of our people here, right? And so it's time that we put numbers behind these narrative points that we always talk about. We want to show that thousands of people in ex-politicians' district reject that they receive funding from AIPAC and will not vote for them because they continuously take support from AIPAC and prioritize the interests of Israel over the interests of the American people. And so I think there's really an opportunity for us to start to collect data and use that data as leverage to show that this is where the majority of the people stand, and you either get in line or you'll be pushed out by the people. And then there's one more thing that I want to make sure I brush on before we pass it back. I know we'll probably have a short period of time for Q&A. But there was a question around like how do we make sense of this campaign and the way that we are positioning AIPAC with the truth that the U.S. supports Israel because Israel is really an arm of the U.S. in the Middle East, and it serves the U.S.'s imperial interests. Um, and I think that these ideas are not necessarily in contradiction, right? We don't believe that the only way to isolate Zionism and to weaken Zionism is through targeting its political arm. We think that, of course, there needs to be a variety of methods and tactics and campaigns that we are taking so that we weaken Zionism's basis of support, which I mentioned earlier, are economic, military and defense, political, diplomatic, and social and cultural, right? These four bases of support for Zionism, we aim to weaken each and every one of them, not because we think that is what'll lead to the direct liberation of Palestine. We're not, under a false assumption that the only reason why the U.S. supports Israel is because of AIPAC funding, but because we understand that Zionism does depend on these institutions. Israel does depend on these institutions. And that's why they go through all of these efforts to keep their donors private, to keep their activities under the radar, because they don't want the American people to know what they're really doing behind the scenes. So I'll pause here and say that, weakening any arm, I think, of Zionism is a hit to the state of Israel as a whole and the imperial interest that the US has in the region. And so, again, encourage people to take a moment right now. Maybe we can do it together if that's okay, Celine. I'll pass it to you to facilitate. But just to sign the petition on the US AIPAC out website.
Thank you so much, Nida. That was so well said. And thank you all for addressing questions throughout. It made it easier on me to track them. Yeah, let's take a few minutes. While in the last like 9 minutes we have together, please, as you're listening, just sign the petition. Let's send that in the chat one more time. So just give me 1 minute we'll send it in the chat here. Sign the petition and circulate it. Like send this to 5, 10 people one-on-one. We have over 300 people on this webinar right now. So would love to see folks signing the pledge and the petition to get AIPAC out of US politics. And again, like as Nida is saying, like the reason that they're going to such great lengths to scrub their websites of certain things or to hide donors is because the increasing isolation of Israel, and we can use that, we can leverage that momentum and that shift in public opinion to really advance our campaigns. And what Gaza has exposed in the past 2 years is not just the true nature of Zionism as a genocidal project. It exposed the United States and made it really clear to people, or more clear to people, that the interests of the U.S. ruling class are not the same as the interests of everyday people in the U.S. So, and AIPAC is a representation of that. It's a representation of American ruling class interests, and you can follow the AIPAC out Instagram. Maybe Nida, if you can drop that in the chat. There's really useful information on this Instagram page. Like I was just reading it, some posts today, and we can learn like by who are the donors that we do know about. Like these are ultra wealthy people who literally profit from displacement and exploitation in the U.S. There's one post about Adam Tantleff or something in New York, who's like a big real estate guy who's basically playing a huge role in destroying affordable housing in New York and sits on the board of the Friends of the IDF and donates to AIPAC, and his law firm is literally fighting tenants. He's basically pouring millions of dollars into strengthening Israel's influence over US politics because it benefits his class interests, not the interests of working people. So these are the same people responsible for pushing, everyday people in the U.S. out of their homes, for undermining unions, for deepening inequality in the U.S. Are the same ones that are funneling money into sustaining Israel's military occupation and genocide because it lines their pockets. Like when we're talking about where taxpayer money goes, it's going to these weapons corporations to make weapons to send to Israel. It's like lining the pockets of these CEOs and these companies' shareholders. So it's really important that we expose this to further isolate Israel by weakening the legitimacy of Zionist institutions. And again, like we can start very easily by signing the petition and visiting the Reject AIPAC website that just dropped in the chat, visiting the AIPAC Out of US Politics website and Instagram page. And before we close, just want to say that on November 29th, this is the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. As the U.S. moves to occupy Gaza through the Trump-imposed Board of Peace, it's our time to reassert our demands and push for an arms embargo, push for the rejection of AIPAC. And at these mobilizations, it's a really good place to literally just pass out flyers and information about the AIPAC out pledge, the petition, and get people to sign on. So we have 5 minutes left here. We'll send out materials in the follow-up. Glad to see that people are signing. Really encourage you all, again, mobilize on the 29th. There's also a course coming up at the People's Forum about America's forever wars in the Middle East that's going to focus on, how it's the imperialist system, not any one politician in office, but it's the imperialist system that keeps America at war and invested in genocide. And again, the reason we talk about these things is we want to understand our opposition to understand how we have to confront it. So I think we have 4 minutes left. So maybe just like really quick, let me see like if there's any questions you all didn't already address. Let's see. I think, yeah, there was one question we did see about what exactly is the relationship between AIPAC and the Israeli government, and maybe we can just wrap there. It sounds like we'll need to have more webinars on this topic. A lot of people on today asking a lot of questions, and again, we'll try to address them in the follow-up email, but maybe just this can be our closing one. I don't know, Iman or Nida, if you want to.
Yeah, I'll speak a little bit to this, and Iman, I'm curious if you know more than I do, or something different. Then I'll say this much. Of course, part of maintaining its image for AIPAC is maintaining that it is a completely independent organization from from the Israeli government. That's really how it circumvents this registration as a foreign agent. But what we know to be true is that at any major AIPAC convening, the prime minister, the genocidal prime minister Netanyahu will be present. Right. The president of the Zionist entity will be present and speaking uh, to the attendees. And if we go back and we look at some of these speeches and some of these conferences, what we really see is Israeli politicians directly thanking AIPAC for securing support for Israel in the US, and crediting AIPAC for the military aid package, for the weapons sales deals, all of these things very openly. Right. And we also know that when they are sending politicians on paid vacations in occupied Palestine through the American Israeli Education Fund, they're also having meetings with Israeli politicians, where Israeli politicians are naming what they would like to see from American lawmakers. So that's, in many ways, the connection is very clear. It's very much in your face. But of course, we see that AIPAC, is attempting to circumvent this like narratively, right? Like we're an American interest group, but we know that to of course not be true. And yeah, again, curious, Celine or Iman, if y'all even want to add on to that.
I think I just add the one thing that I would probably just want to add is that there are, I think you were just touching on it, Nadat, like the constant delegation trips that AIPAC puts on to bring folks to Israel to meet with to meet with like these Israeli lawmakers, policymakers, like IOF soldiers, all these folks that they generally try to use in a way to kind of coerce American politicians. And these things happen often. We've actually starting to see the rise in like state delegations. So there's a recent delegation that had, I think, a little over 100 local officials that just went to Israel. And I just can't believe that these delegation trips are even ongoing in the midst of a genocide. But they're continuing and they're meeting with these folks who represent the Israeli government. So I think there's just I just want to amplify the fact that this is consistent. And then one thing that I would just want to add as well is like there's a lot of like policy synchronization. So oftentimes AIPAC actually advocates for policies in line with the Israeli government priorities. And that can include like military aid packages. So oftentimes what's being talked about in the Knesset can actually line up with what AIPAC is pushing for here. It'll even, it'll push for or push against weapons sales to like Israeli adversaries. It's again supports its ongoing sanctions on Iran, and it pushes back against any sort of UN resolution that's critical of Israel. So it really does deeply align itself with the Israeli government over and over again. And I think it's quite telling of its relationship.
That was perfect. Really well said, both of you, Iman and Nida. Thank you so much for talking to us about the role that AIPAC plays and how we can intervene. Obviously, like we are able to make major shifts as like everyday people involved in the movement in solidarity with Palestine. And thank you all so much for joining us. We're going to send the links and the recording in the follow-up, and we'll see you on the next month's webinar. So. Thanks, everyone. Take care. And if we didn't get to your questions, we'll follow up with materials in the email. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.